we're live. We're just getting set up, making sure it's working. Looks like we're live.
Great.
All right. You guys hear us all right in the chat?
Tell us if you hear us okay and if our audio is leveled out okay. Sweet.
I see a yup.
Someone said yes.
All right, let me grab into this chat here, get the super chat going. Looks like we are live. Cool.
Nice. Just getting set up, guys.
Yep.
We're waiting a
Just
couple
gonna
of seconds.
let some people join
Cool.
as we're getting started. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Grab the water.
Little low I hear, so I'm gonna turn the volume up.
Little low.
Yell at me if the audio's too loud, please.
Right. Yeah, tell us if the audio is too loud or low or... We know that we're echoey. There's nothing we can do about that. Very low audio. Very low audio.
How's this? Check, 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 check.
Check, check.
Good Lord.
Still low?
All right, I'm gonna crank it. Check, 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 check.
Boomer
All right,
time.
audio's, I see audio good and all right.
Boomer time. Cool. All right.
Much better. Audio is perf. I'm going
All right.
to go with what everyone's saying.
All right, we trust you.
Okay.
We completely trust you.
Right. All right.
All right.
Should we get started?
Yeah, let's get started, Mike. So, of course, we wanted to call this emergency live stream in response to the escalation of war, the potential of a new war. We're already in the third iteration of the Iraq War, have been for quite some time with Trump's escalation there and the continuous deployment of troops there. And now, of course, as Mike pointed out today, the biggest kind of movement, escalation from the U.S. empire on a sovereign state, I think, since the Iraq War, with this bombing of a top commander, a top general in the Iranian government. That just happened yesterday. So we're going to talk about a quick timeline of events. We're going to go over a lot of stuff and talk about what you can do and what's being done to stop this war. So, Mike, let's talk about a timeline of events before we go off into kind of our armchair analysis. Specifically, you being an Iraq War veteran, you have a lot of crucial insight on what's going on and what people can do who are especially enlisted. So, you brought this to my attention. I think it's really important to lay the scope of this conversation by talking about how the U.S. has been bombing Iraq for 28 years. Think about that.
Yeah. So I guess we'll go back a little bit. Abby, maybe while I do that, could you put out our live link to the social medias and everything so people know that we're going? Everyone, if you can, share up the link so people see it. Because we're going to get into kind of all the things that you need to know about the current war danger, which is, I think, very serious. I think that the only reason it hasn't exploded into a crisis at this point is because the Iranian government, the Iraqi government are way more level-headed and sane than our government. And so I think they're weighing a kind of measured, possibly international response to what the U.S. Has been doing. So I think we're lucky that the leaders of the countries that we're attacking are not as belligerent as the United States government, because it would be quite a different situation if they were. But yeah, as Abby said, we've been bombing Iraq for 30 years. This started under H.W. Bush in the 90s. Actually, 1990 is when we started bombing Iraq. And it continuously, every single administration since then has bombed Iraq. Every single president has bombed Iraq since then. It's always been for different reasons, right? Different rationales for why we had to do this. But of course, the core The core reasons have been the same. Of course, this all really culminated in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq and the occupation, which we'll get into a bit because there's a lot of lessons from the Iraq occupation that we need to take into account today. But a major thing that happened is that the U.S. really got kicked out by the Iraqi resistance, in particular by the Mahdi army, and by these so-called Iranian-backed militias, who are Iraqis who are completely justified in defending their homeland from the brutality of the U.S. occupation. The U.S. was really defeated handedly by these anti-occupation forces, and there was kind of a deal worked out at the very last minute where the U.S. would keep some forces in Iraq, working with the Iraqi government. Of course, when ISIS exploded, this became a much closer relationship. In fact, the U.S. collaborating with this very Iranian-backed militias that we're told we should be killing and destroying right now. But the U.S. always maintained a presence. While the actual U.S. occupation of Iraq ended, yes, technically there were still U.S. troops in Iraq, and that is an occupation. But we're talking occupation in the sense of U.S. soldiers on the streets, manning checkpoints, raiding people's houses every single day, cordoning off villages and sweeping everyone up in mass arrests, shooting at vehicles randomly and through convoys. That's what occupation really is. And so the U.S. occupation, the formal occupation, was really driven out, and U.S. forces were kind of stuck in these little, in their embassy, in this green zone and so forth. But, the anti-war movement had always demanded that the U.S. get out completely. Because as long as there's U.S. troops there, the forces that kick them out are there saying, if you step out of line, we'll start shooting at you again. And the only reason the U.S. was able to withdraw and exist in these little areas is because the U.S. just started paying all of these Iranian-backed militias who were defeating the U.S. forces, just started paying them to say, just stop shooting at us for a little while so we can make it look like we had some kind of victory. So the kind of constant presence of U.S. forces has always kind of been put us on the precipice of this exploding into a bad situation again. And so the way that this current situation popped off is that...
We wanted you to check out a little timeline. So you
sure.
Can
Yeah.
From that.
Go ahead.
So I think it's important to preempt what happened in the last 72 hours by talking about the fact that Iraqis, as Mike has been mentioning, the fact that the U.S. presence has never really left Iraq, the fact that the U.S. has been bombing Iraq for nearly 30 years, every single president. This is a bipartisan policy. Iraqis have been protesting in the streets for months, right? This has already been kind of a culmination of things where tens of thousands of Iraqis have been protesting for basic human rights, water, electricity, housing, jobs. They've been convening in the square, making kind of makeshift Occupy-style encampments, trying to call attention to the fact that they wanted this entire regime, U.S. puppet regime that was installed from the perpetual U.S. occupation to end, to completely fold. And they were met with sniper fire. They were gunned down mercilessly. Rescue workers, peaceful protesters. The videos were absolutely horrifying that I saw. So just remember that before this all happened, that Iraqis were in the tens of thousands protesting for their human rights and dignity. They were met with sniper fire. And also, no one talked about it, right? The media completely ignored it. Of course, the U.S. government completely ignored it because the oil kept flowing. Nothing was really impeding U.S. imperialism in the region. And of course, the U.S. doesn't care about protests unless they're useful tools for imperialism and for efforts of regime change. So yeah, that's what happened. And so, Mike, why don't you talk about what happened in the last 72 hours, starting with this militia that you're talking about now, the Popular Mobilization Unit, Kataib Hezbollah, and this contractor and everything that kind of happened since.
Yeah, I mean, so, you have some notes?
Yeah. if you need them.
Okay. So correct me if I miss anything in the timeline. But this was set off by a rocket that hit an area with U.S. mercenaries in it. Not U.S. soldiers, but U.S. mercenaries. They haven't yet said who they are and what they were doing. I mean, were they strike team mercenaries? Or they a radio mechanic? Was it some CIA, Intel, private, BlackRock type guy? But anyways, an American military contractor, mercenary, was killed in one of these attacks. It's not known who carried out this attack. It's not known if it was intended to kill Americans. It's not known if it was this so-called Iranian-backed militia. It's Iraq. It's a dangerous place. There's rockets and bullets flying every single inch, all the time. So it's not unlikely that an American is going to get killed. And in fact, it's kind of wild that not many Americans have been killed over the past few months.
Yeah, how many contractors are there, though? I mean, the fact that there's already thousands and thousands of troops, at least 5,000, with the 3,000 more, and we don't really know how many military contractors there are. That's pretty disturbing.
There's a lot. I mean, just a quick segue. I mean, there's in Iraq, 5,000 U.S. soldiers died. In Afghanistan, 2,500 U.S. soldiers died. More contractors have been, American contractors have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan than soldiers. So that speaks to the amount of contractors that are there and says that they're not doing just, radio repairs. They're doing, very different types of things. They blamed, the U.S. government immediately blamed this group, which they don't like because it's a counter to its hegemony in the country. So they blame this organization, they blame this Iranian-backed militia, as they always like to call it, which we'll get into in a minute, and they just unilaterally bomb them, and they killed dozens of Iraqis, who are Iraqis that previously they had just been fighting ISIS and defeated ISIS. That's what they were doing. And in fact, they were integrating into the Iraqi security forces and had worked kind of in collaboration with the United States against ISIS. This wasn't this wasn't ISIS people, this wasn't Al-Qaeda. We can get into if that would have even been justified, but these were forces that were not we're not like a so-called enemy, as they like to say. So unilaterally just kills dozens of Iraqis in their own country, which was a war crime, blaming them for the attack and then reserving the right to kill dozens of them. So that resulted in massive protests, which were different than the protests. There's been protests against government corruption for many months where snipers have been killing large numbers of people. That's, in a way, a separate topic.
And they blamed Iranians for that, too.
They blamed Iranians for that as well. Yeah, meddling and whatever. As if, there's no reason to protest in Iraq. It's just going great there. And so in the midst of these days of protests at the U.S. Embassy, of course, the United States starts rushing more Marines to defend the embassy. And even the Marine commander came out and said, anyone who tries to rush our embassy will be met with a buzzsaw, referring to machine gun fire, cutting them in half. And that was a real threat to the protesters, saying that if you try to rush our embassy, we're just going to cut you in half with high caliber machine guns. So a pretty heavy threat. So of course the protests at the embassy, very justifiable, because if some other country was in the United States and just would, whenever it wanted, bomb groups of Americans and kill them with no reason or legality or anything, you can imagine that people would be quite upset. So the protest. So in the midst of this, and already this was oh damn, this stuff is heating up. In the midst of this is when Trump decides to assassinate one of the most important people in Iran, who was leading the anti-ISIS fight in Syria and Iraq, but an important figure, a beloved figure in Iran, not liked by all, but definitely someone who's considered an important figure in Iranian society and in the Iranian government. So it just straight up assassinates him, the leader of Iraqi militia, and kills many other people as well. And so in the midst of this kind of big upheaval over this initial airstrike, there's this assassination that happens, which is a straight up assassination. It's a war crime. It's illegal. You can't do this. It's an action that quite obviously would warrant, the U.S. knows that Iran isn't going to just sit back and let this kind of thing happen. And then so that's what put us in the crisis of the past 24 hours. And then the last I saw is that, again, the United States bombed another convoy of the same so-called Iranian-backed militia, which, again, we'll get into, killing about a dozen other Iraqis. Killing 6 Iraqis, and including high-ranking commanders. And so it's almost like they're provoked. They want a response. It's they're baiting into oh, you didn't do anything after we killed your top commander, we're going to keep killing you or whatever. So it's that's the precipice that we're on. I think that Trump gave this speech today where he said everything's on the table, we're willing to do whatever type thing. I mean, it was hard to understand him because he's so jacked up on uppers, he's very cracked out.
He was trying to say that he's doing this to stop a war, guys.
Right.
This was done because he actually wants to end these endless wars, and this was a necessary measure to stop war. Isn't that interesting? So we have this anti-interventionist leader, and then you have people, these loyal servants to Trump, these jackboot foot soldiers to him, just parroting all of his rhetoric. And it's just oh my God, open your eyes. I mean, this is insane what he's doing.
It's funny that there's always every strike that the U.S. does is defensive. No matter who the U.S. attacks, it's a defensive strike because, it's defensive because if we didn't strike them, they were going to strike us, right? I mean, this is the rationale that like Nazi Germany used to invade Poland. They're like, well, they're going to attack us, so we have the right to, in self-defense, invade and occupy Poland. I mean, it's the same rationale. And so it's all framed as like, yes, an attack to prevent an attack, which is just absurd because if the whole idea is we had to attack this commander to prevent an attack on the United States. Well, isn't this thing kind of like the biggest thing that could cause Iran to attack the United States? Like if you're really concerned with stopping an attack on the United States, do you want to do the one thing that they probably can't excuse and like have to respond to?
Right, yeah, no, exactly. And the fact that they actually drone bombed this guy at a Baghdad airport. Yeah. I mean, that's insane.
It's the airport.
Yeah, it's the airport. And
it's like LAX. It's like if like a diplomat from Russia was coming into LAX and they just like...
Yeah, and Mike, why don't we talk about who Kataib Hezbollah is? It's a PMU unit that not only was recruited to fight the Islamic State in recent years, but it also was kind of a reiteration of a Shiite militia that existed long before fighting ISIS as part of the resistance in Iraq against the U.S. occupation. Yeah,
well, a lot of these armed militias that exist today in Iraq, like the Mahdi Army, which is a different one, but affiliated. I mean, these didn't exist prior to the invasion in 2003. These were all militias that formed as defense units to the U.S. occupation. I mean, as I said, it's like neighborhoods were just being assaulted every single day. People were being killed for no reason, rounded up and sent to torture facilities for no reason. I mean, it was it's kind of it's weird that we're on the precipice of another major war there to kind of think back to the reality of what the Iraq War was. I mean, if there was social media in 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, like today it's like we take for granted that in Gaza we can see photos and videos coming from the front lines. It's like if that existed during the Iraq War, I think that there would be a much different memory and understanding of what the U.S. occupation really looked like on a daily basis. And so, of course, as any people would in any country that was living under just kind of daily brutal occupation, with no sign of Americans leaving and stopping what they were doing, people started forming their own self-defense organizations. This started very slowly as just kind of individual people, because lots of people had guns, lots of people had access to weapons that were lying around. In my era, like the common thing was like a farmer who had like a mortar buried in his farmland, and every day when he'd be rotating around like with his goats, he'd stop off, pop some mortars off, bury it in the ground, and then go back. And then that kind of grew into people networking together, organizing ambushes in their villages. And so if the U.S. was going to come in to round people up, they would ambush the vehicles and things like that. And then militias formed, like actual organized militias formed. And of course, we'll get into kind of the snowball effect of things, but once Americans start getting attacked, right, even if it's justified, the U.S. government doesn't say, oh shit, we're being attacked, like let's get out of here. They go even harder. And so the more the Iraqi people resisted, the more of the brutality of the U.S. came down. And if you talk to people like a friend of mine, Ethan McCord, great guy, who's actually in the collateral murder video, the guy that saves the kids out of the vehicles, he said that they were told their strategy is to out-terrorize the terrorists, meaning that when they're being attacked, if they're going to shoot at us, we got to be even more brutal to every single person. And so the more that escalated, the more organized these Iraqi militias got, the more sophisticated they got, and the more they reached out to help to their neighbors. And so, yes, when we talk about Iranian-backed militias and people saying that Soleimani, he's responsible for murdering hundreds of Americans, they use that term murdering. Right. It's because Iraqis reached out for help from their neighbors to say, please come help us stop this shit from happening, stop us from being murdered. And so Iran did help. They sent weapons, they helped with some training, and even some Iranian fighters came. It was mostly Iraqi fighters, but even some Iranians went, but they were invited by the people of that country, right? They had the right to do that. They had the right to be there. It was the U.S. soldiers who had no right to be there. So that's kind of like the the background on what these forces are. And so a lot of these militias still exist today. They became, once the US withdrew, there of course was some like kind of ceasefire agreements where they said, all right, the US withdrew, they're not on our streets anymore, and we're in this kind of coalition against ISIS or whatever.
And so now they're part of an established Iraqi security force, which is why it's so offensive to call it an Iranian-backed militia instead of just saying we're actually bombing Iraqi soldiers.
Yeah.
Because they are technically part of the Iraqi security forces. And also this whole notion that, how do you pronounce his name? Soleimani?
Yeah, I think so.
Was responsible for killing hundreds of American boys in Iraq, right? This notion that we keep hearing over and over again, repeated ad nauseum, not only by war hawks and neoconservatives, and bloodlusting, generals, but also by Democratic presidential contenders like Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren and even Julian Castro, which I was really shocked. They all kind of are parroting the same thing, that this guy was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans and thousands of civilians, Mike. Gareth Porter, an investigative journalist that has really narrowed in on Iran in general, has debunked this entire narrative pretty thoroughly. He talks about how this was a narrative that was initiated by Cheney back during the escalation of the Iraq War when they wanted to justify an attack on Iran. He has a really great article debunking that entire narrative that this guy was responsible for, overseeing the deaths of pretty much anyone. Yeah. So it's a great article. I recommend people checking it out. But it's important to just debunk that notion because it's so offensive to take away the agency of Iraqis. Not only protesting, and not only this U.S. puppet government that is responsible for sniping all these protesters, but also just the militias, because then it just makes it seem like this is all being orchestrated, and it just becomes not just Iraqis, right? This is no longer an effect of the U.S. occupation and perpetual bombing campaign there. This is just all Iran, Mike.
Yeah, and I think that we should talk about that framing, because everyone who conceded Soleimani was a really bad guy, he murdered Americans, but I disagree with how Trump handled it, whatever. Like, this reminds me exactly of when the invasion of Iraq was starting. And of course, there's going to be a lot of parallels. When it became, you had to first accept the premise of the war, that Saddam Hussein is a brutal dictator who's a threat to national security, he's killed his own people, and he's going to kill Americans, and something must be done, but not this.
Right.
And the kind of pressure of everyone to preface their supposed anti-war statement with accepting the entire Pentagon and establishment rationale for the war, whether or not you think it's true, it immediately traps you in their argument. Yep. And so if you start by saying, yes, what you're saying about this person is true, he's an evil, brutal murderer who's a threat to US lives, yes, but then you're automatically trapped in the argument, well, if you agree he's this evil, brutal murderer who's a threat to US lives, what do you think should be done? And maybe you're just not strong enough on this guy. And maybe Trump is stronger on the guy that's a terrorist and needs to be taken out, and you're too weak to handle the terrorist who's murdered hundreds of Americans. You want to let the terrorist who murdered hundreds of Americans just get away and live a happy life? And so it automatically traps you in this argument. And so it's completely unhelpful. And so Elizabeth Warren, we're going to go through actually what all the candidates said. But why
don't you initiate how just destructive that is? And this is the same with Maduro. It's the same with everyone that's under the, in the crosshairs of U.S. empire. And you have this false equivocation and all of these liberals who pretend like this is all for humanitarian causes at the very end, but it's being done militarily wrong, right? Strategically wrong. And the consequences are going to be...
Basically, if the Democrats had done it, it would have been different.
It would have been good. Right? Yeah. They still want to kill the guy extrajudicially, but they want to do it the right way, right? Like Obama said, waging the right war, not the dumb war. Yeah. So it's a really destructive and harmful argument that just perpetuates U.S. imperialism and just provides cover for the Pentagon and Trump, of course, which is what the Democrats have been doing this whole time. But go on.
Especially when it's on the precipice of a new war.
Right.
It's just not fucking necessary. It's as the war drums are beating, as we're at a moment where at any point, all that's needed now is to be countering the U.S. narrative and saying that we will not accept a new war from starting. And so much of the coverage has been about this guy and how he was going to plan an attack on Americans and how everyone's admitting that, yes, he was a really bad guy. And it's just helping the Trump administration with what they're going to do. And it's just complete and utter weakness of everyone that has fallen for this thing.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about how what the media has been saying, or before that, you mentioned the fact that he was a mixed figure. I think it's important to talk about in Iran, and I've seen videos coming out of Iran in the subway, people chanting "Down with America," hundreds of Iranian youths basically calling to bring down our government. I don't blame them. This is coming after crippling sanctions and, of course, just relentless terrorism and aggression from the U.S. empire on Iran for decades, and we can get into that later. But General Soleimani was actually a really popular figure in Iran, highly popular. He was viewed very favorably in Iranian society. Internal polls show that 82% of the population viewed him as a really, really favorable, popular figure. 59%, I guess, very favorable, 82% favorable. So that really shows you the popularity of him within Iranian society, right. The fact that he was a leader in crushing the Islamic State, which I think was a much greater threat to that region than Americans really understand, this kind of bloodletting that was fostered and fomented by the consequences of U.S. imperialism in the region. So that's really important to say. Iran's commander of the Revolutionary Guard has come out and said, we are not afraid of any war. Iraq's Grand Mufti came out and basically called on all Iraqi Sunnis to unite with Iraqi Shias in attacking the U.S. He says, quote, "My army and I are ready to destroy America, the great Satan. God is with us and we shall be victorious." This shows you the sentiment there right now. This is not a joke. This is not, this is a hugely popular figure who was very high up in the government, and he was just assassinated via drone.
Yeah, can I say something about that really quickly about the Mahdi army thing? I mean, this is big. I mean, so the Mahdi army, which defeated the U.S., it's a highly organized army. It's not just like guys with AKs. They have armored vehicles. They're an army. They're a real army. They are the ones that agreed when the U.S. was withdrawing from Iraq. They agreed to stop killing Americans because they said, all right, we have this. Obama had his withdrawal deadline. And they're like, okay, you're going to get out. And you're not going to be on our streets anymore. We'll stop killing you. But if you're still here, we're going to start fucking you up again. As Obama was negotiating the end of the Iraq War, which he gets a lot of credit for, he sent Robert Gates, the then Secretary of Defense, to Iraq to try to negotiate an extension of the Status of Forces Agreement. That's when Chelsea Manning released the Iraq war logs, which revealed to Iraqi society the extent to which the U.S. had been killing Iraqi civilians and getting away with it. And the immunity for U.S. soldiers who commit crimes became a big contingent for the Iraqi government for whether or not the U.S. could extend the Status of Forces Agreement. But the Mahdi army, when Gates was in Iraq trying to get the U.S. to stay in Iraq longer, which is what Obama really wanted to do, the Mahdi army held a march of 100,000 armed people with all their military vehicles, with all their rockets, with all their equipment, marching over an American flag and saying, if you are here one day past the day that we're allowing you, we are going to start killing you again. And then the U.S. said, all right, we'll go back to this area where we're allowed, and we're not going to risk that. Because they're basically it was a flex. They were like, we can start obliterating you at any time. And if you don't do what we say right now, we're going to do it. And the U.S. acquiesced, and the U.S. Pulled back to the area that they were told that they had to pull back to. The fact that they are now again saying it is back on, I mean, it doesn't matter how many U.S. special forces you have there, it will be devastating. It's something that would need the scale in terms of a military standpoint. For the U.S. to achieve any kind of military win there, they would have to send more soldiers than they sent to Iraq during the troop surge, because it's this army, it's all these other militias that are working with them, uniting with them, and Iran. It's at such another scale than the height of the Iraq War, and the height of the Iraq War was pretty fucking bad.
Yeah, and now you have people talking about Israel's involvement and foreknowledge of this, Mike. I mean, the fact that Israel knew about the drone strike days before Trump initiated it,
and Congress didn't.
Before Congress knew, of course, that this was done completely unilaterally without congressional approval, of course. Senator Ted Cruz, and I wanted to say some stuff about Israel more, but Senator Ted Cruz praised Trump's killing as a long overdue justice for our Israeli allies, which becomes a little bit more clear when you look at what Israel's response is to this. And do not forget, of course, the context of this, the fact that Netanyahu has been the main driver behind the dismantlement of the Iran nuclear deal, the fact that he came to Congress in an unprecedented fashion years ago to appeal to Congress, begging them to vote against the Iran nuclear deal, saying this is a horrible deal for the US. That was insane. That was insane that he did that. You have Sheldon Adelson, the top funder of the Trump administration, and of course Congress, who has advocated for nuking Iran. So these are huge hardcore Zionists that have had a huge influence in this entire process, and of course have basically just been a big influence on Trump's advocacy toward Israel and of course aggression toward Iran. But here's how Netanyahu responded to this. He said, President Donald Trump is, quote, worthy of full appreciation for acting with determination, strongly and swiftly, he said. And here's the funny part, guys. You know the so-called left in Iran, this opposition party that we were told the left was going to win, Mike, and unfortunately Netanyahu is just...
In Israel.
Iran, I'm sorry, in Israel. We keep hearing this notion that there's a left and that there's a solid opposition, and Netanyahu's on his way out because he's corrupt. Well, even so-called opposition parties within Israel chimed in to agree. You had Amir Peretz, head of the quote-unquote center-left, right, Labor Party, said that this guy deserved to die. He thanked Trump. You have Benny Gantz, former head of the IMF, a war criminal who was also touted as a leftist, basically between Trump in the last election. He said the killing was an appropriate response to anyone responsible for murder of countless innocent people and for undermining global stability. So you just have this narrative being parroted over and over again. But it's just funny that when you look at Israel and you even have people like Ted Cruz, kind of the cat out of the bag, being like, this was justice for Israel. It is disgusting when you look at how Israel has nuclear weapons, Iran does not. And the fact that they were privy to this drone strike. And Mike, reports are coming out that Israel was already launching drone strikes against this militia for months via U.S. military bases with the knowledge and approval of the U.S. already for weeks and weeks, potentially months. So this has already been happening, building up to this.
Yeah, I believe it.
So let's talk about the media beating the drums for this and how the media just uniformly lines up and acts as the arm of the Pentagon whenever you are on the precipice of war, including Democratic Party officials. And we're going to go over all of their statements. But first, Mike, I want to get your response to some of this absurd media coming out. As Chomsky said, I mean, a dictator would admire the uniformity of the U.S. media. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. It's so shocking that you have, the neoliberal media, of course, Fox is locked up with Trump, but you have the neoliberal media machine, the blob, right, the neoliberal blob, and all these military-industrial complex people just going on talking about how Trump is this dangerous figure who's mentally ill. He's an aberration to normalcy. How could we ever possibly allow him to do anything? They continue to fund endless military budgets. The last one was near $1 trillion with the NDAA, expand his surveillance powers. And now on the eve of a war that could be so much more catastrophic than the Iraq war, what are they doing, Mike? They're going on the news and talking about how bad of a guy this guy was and how he needed to die and how Trump is actually good for bombing him. CNBC put out an article that the title of the headline, America just took out the world's #1 bad guy. Are we a nation of children? Are we a nation of children? And in it, I mean, it basically says, we're already hearing from a number of critics that this move will likely backfire against the U.S. and will provoke Iran to retaliate even more forcibly against Americans. Even more forcibly? When the fuck have they retaliated before? To those people making those warnings, there's really only one thing to say. Welcome to the party, pal. Really responsible journalism from CNBC there. And Mike, this is just across the board. MSNBC running stories all day about how this general was planning attacks on U.S. diplomats and soldiers with zero evidence. Zero evidence. WMD's 2.0.
Yeah, the evidence is the Pentagon said so. It's like, we want to kill this guy. Trust me, he's going to do something bad. And it's like, oh, that's the story. You know what I mean? It's like media is supposed to not just report what people in power say. They're supposed to analyze, is this true? Can this be verified? Does this line up with the facts, but they're not doing that. They're literally just reporting exactly what the Pentagon and Trump, for that matter, is saying. I mean, I think the top story I saw after this happened was like CNBC that said that the U.S. just killed the Middle East's #1 bad guy. And that was the headline. It was like, oh, great. That sounds like a really good thing that happened.
It keeps changing.
Right.
First it was Maduro, and then it was Putin, and now it's this guy that no one's ever heard of before. But he was the #1 bad guy, guys. He was going to kill a bunch of Americans.
Oh, right. Yeah. There's an endless line of. It's like the deck of cards when the Iraq was invaded in 2003. There was like a deck of cards. Saddam was like the ace of spades, but there's all these other guys. Every card was a different top bad guy. And so like success was measured in the first years of the Iraq war was, ooh, what guy in the deck of cards we got? And the war couldn't be over until you got everyone in the deck of cards. But then the more the war goes, the more people get added to the deck of cards because then more new leaders replace older leaders. And it's just like...
You mean the global war on terror hasn't stopped terrorism worldwide? That's shocking. But also, Mike, I thought we were getting them over there so they wouldn't get us over here, right? Is that still a thing? And then speaking of the Bush administration and its absurd rhetoric, very babyish, childish rhetoric, Ari Fleischer, Bush administration official, was just on the news all day talking about how people are celebrating in Iran, Mike. They're all out in the streets with candy and flowers, thanking American troops, thanking the great Satan, America, for taking out a leader who was favorably rated at very high levels, 82%. Can you imagine if any? I don't think any U.S. politician has that high of favorability here. People view Congress like more reprehensible than cockroaches in this country. So that's disgusting. To repeat this absurd propaganda, you have Jake Tapper, never met a war he didn't like, on CNN. You know, he's retweeting Oz Kajari, this notorious regime change troll, who said, if you genuinely think the best situation for world peace is keeping a man who butchered as many civilians as Soleimani did, then I suggest your definition of world peace needs some fine-tuning. Very responsible journalism, Jake. Thank you so much. Of course, you have Susan Rice on CNN saying he was a murderer, a terrorist of the worst order. How? How was he a terrorist of the worst order? What the hell did he do? How was he a murderer? It's just disgusting. Couldn't you say the same thing about the CIA?
That would be valid, right?
That would be absolutely valid. Christine Amanpour, CNN, talking about how he was at the height of his power when he was taken out, but it's not the person you take out, it's what they leave behind, right? Al-Qaeda didn't end with the death of bin Laden. ISIS didn't end with the death of al-Baghdadi. Critical to know what the strategy is for the next steps, Mike. As Dan Cohen said, to compare this guy to ISIS and Al-Qaeda is just shockingly irresponsible and grotesque. You should be ashamed of yourself, Christine Amanpour. And then, of course, you have Fox News, Mr. Anti-Neocon Mr. Neocon, right? Worked at the Weekly Standard for years, right next to Bill Kristol, turned Mr. Anti-Neocon, Tucker Carlson, twisting himself in knots to blame the neocons, right? They're the ones who want this, Mike. It's not Trump. Trump really doesn't want a war with Iran. I don't know how you can possibly blame John Bolton since he left the administration quite some time ago, but that's what you have over at Fox. Trump does not really want to do this himself, Mike, so pay no heed to the continuous stream of tweets coming out of Trump's ass, basically saying they will pay dearly for everything that they've done. This is a threat, we're going to annihilate you, etc.
I mean, Trump campaigned on bombing Iran. I mean, he literally said that his famous line of like, we'll blow their ships out of the water. I mean, he campaigned on tearing up the Iranian nuclear agreement, which he immediately did. I mean, so the fact that there's someone pulling the strings and like making Trump do stuff he doesn't want to do, like this is the rhetoric he got into office on and immediately started following through on putting more devastating sanctions on Iran, getting him out of the Iranian nuclear agreement, and other types of actions that were blatant acts of aggression as well. Bringing us to this point, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, so the whole idea that, he was like an anti-interventionist and whatever, it's like he campaigned on war and he expanded every single war that was going on that he inherited when he took office. And so this isn't out of the blue. I mean, I think there's been a lot of people even surprised, like, I thought he was the anti-interventionist president. It's like, this is the last year of his administration. He's already been president for 3 fucking years, and all he's done is expand war, increase bombings, increase it's like he's been showing this whole time.
But Mike, he tweeted, I want to end the endless wars. It doesn't matter what he's actually doing on the ground to maneuver all these troops out of Syria back into the perpetual occupation of Iraq, the devastating genocidal sanctions all across Latin America, the devastating coups, the bloodletting, right-wing fascist takeovers, attempt in Venezuela, succeeded in Bolivia, overthrowing all the normalization efforts with Cuba. But he tweeted he wanted to end the endless wars, Mike. What about the drone strikes being increased 400%, civilian casualties doubling? It's time to look at what this motherfucker's doing and not what he tweets. Because I saw not only people who just seemed shocked, a lot of like leftists fell prey to this rhetoric as well. I even saw Jeremy Scahill saying Trump is our best hope to actually end the endless wars. What is happening here, guys? What is going on? But I wanted to just point to two more people in the media before we move on to the Democratic Party officials and other people. As Nima Shirazi pointed out on Twitter, this is a real tweet from Vox's national security reporter. So this is like allegedly like the liberal arm of like, you know, media, who hosts a weekly podcast on international affairs. His name is Alex Ward. He said, genuine question for experts. If you have a very good chance to take out this general, what are the reasons not to? Duh. So are we not going to kill like members of the Iranian government if we have a chance to, Mike? Really solid question, you psychopath. And even Michael Ian Black, bad centrist comedians. This is a guy who obsessively was harassing me online because I basically embarrassed him, called out the fact that he did a tour with John McCain's daughter, Meghan McCain, to try to like push centrism. Really embarrassing there, Michael Ian Black, really bad. He even asked, you know, why is war with Iran a bad thing? Really, really, really sad to see this general dumbfuckery and Russia-phobia manifesting into just a complete acquiescence for another war.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think the Michael Ian Black thing, right? I mean, like a really, truly great comedian and actor, Rob Delaney, like tweeted like no war with Iran, and then Michael Ian Black just replies, why? Like a snarky little like bastard. It's like, but of course there's a lot to say about that. You know, why no war with Iran? Like, oh yeah, like that's gonna be fine. Like no one's gonna die. No innocent people are gonna die. You know, it's just gonna be fine. But I think it's emblematic of the kind of larger situation in this country, where you have people who will be completely unaffected by a war with Iran. Mm-hmm. Rich, pampered elites like Michael Ian Black, who are gonna be fine. No one in their family is gonna be sent to die. They have no friends in the countries that are gonna be bombed. And they're so rich and they're so insular in their world that they're gonna be completely unaffected. They're gonna be totally fine. And so why not advocate for the war? Who cares? Like, let's go to war, big deal. And then of course you have the next echelon up, you know, the truly rich, the truly ruling class sectors of the United States. As soon as this assassination happened, oil prices went up and defense contractor stocks went up. And when stocks go up, people make money because people are trading every day. Wall Street's trading constantly. And so the fact that, you know, a massive amounts of profits were made just on the idea of a war possibly taking place, those are the people that are owning these media outlets, that are putting out all these stories about why it was good that this happened. I mean, the people that are pushing us to war, and this is true with the Iraq, this is true with any single US foreign policy action, it's the people that will be completely unaffected, whose kids won't die, whose own life isn't in danger, that are the most gung-ho for war. And that exposes something about this country. I mean, this idea that we're all one nation, right? We're all in this together. Well, I don't have shit in common with Michael Ian Black, and I don't have shit in common with the guy who owned shareholders of Raytheon. How are we in this? How are we one nation? How are we all in this together with these guys? It's like we have more in common with the people that are, you know, our lives are in danger, the people that could be sent to Iraq and Afghanistan, our family and our friends' lives are in danger, and the family and friends of people in Iran and Iraq lives are in danger. So we have a lot more in common with the people that are on the other end of the U.S. bombs than of these people that are cheering them going. And so I think that I'm happy that Michael Ian Black said that, because it's further illustrates. We're a country run by rich elites whose policies that they advocate affect them in no way, but affect negatively the lives of millions and millions of people. And so I think that that's an important thing when we're combating this propaganda to point out, is Iranian people and Iraqi people, they're not our enemies. They pose absolutely no threat to us. And in fact, we have a lot in common with them. And in fact, we have a common enemy, these fucking belligerent monsters that are willing to throw away millions of lives for profits.
Absolutely. And we have a corporate media that's subsidized by the very corporations that are profiteering off of U.S. imperialism and aggression in the Middle East, subsidized by oil companies and defense contractors and pharmaceutical companies. And so I think that sheds some light on why you see kind of this lining up, this uniform narrative that just bolsters whatever aggression is coming from the Pentagon, the war criminals sitting in the White House and the Pentagon, whenever it comes to increased aggression anywhere in the world. And that's what we saw, Mike. We saw that again, even with Trump. We saw Democrats lining up to give him a $1 trillion defense budget. We saw the entire corporate media apparatus giving him a pass. This is a lack of accountability that is deadly, that is criminal. The fact that this military-run media machine gave cover for the Iraq War, was never held accountable, instead demonized those relentlessly who spoke up against these narratives and continue to do so, right? Marginalize, smear, undermine the people who are anti-war activists, who speak out against regime change, and instead just continue to give people like Max Boot and Eli Lake just a platform who are responsible for these policy, I don't want to say misadventures, I mean criminal endeavors over and over and over again. So let's look at who the Democratic politicians who are complicit in this.
Yeah, no, it's just incredible that the Iraq War, widely considered the biggest foreign policy disaster of our lifetimes. And the Iraq War was the greatest atrocity of the modern era. Like, there's no comparison. I mean, people point to the Syria war as like a really devastating catastrophe that happened in the world. Like, what is the death toll of the Syria war now? Is it like, it's like under 500,000, or it's around 250,000 or something? It's like 1 million people died in Iraq. It's like the scale is so different with the Iraq war, the greatest atrocity of my generation. But the people, and it's so widely considered a disaster that every presidential candidate in 2016, even in 2008, had to say, well, yes, the Iraq war was a mistake. At least give it those terms. They all had to admit, so the entire political, even Trump had to say that campaigning. Right. Every politician has to now admit, yes, the Iraq war was a huge blunder, it's a huge, whatever words they use to describe it. Nobody defends the Iraq war anymore. Everyone knows it was like the worst decision ever made. But the same people that were the advocating, writing the articles, or the people that were in the government saying, yes, this is why it's a good thing, on CNN, on MSNBC, advocating for the war, writing articles about it, they are now writing the same fucking articles that are explaining why we need to go to war with Iran and Iraq. I mean, this is a regional war that will span beyond Iraq. Iraq might be the battlefield, but it'll be with Iraqis, with Iranians, and far beyond. How do they have jobs still?
So yeah, someone just did a super chat message. Thank you so much. What's his name? John Duma. He says, finally something to impeach Trump over. Of course. I mean, Trump should have been impeached over his staunch support for Israel, moving the embassy, the Yemen war, putting millions on the brink of starvation, the Venezuela coup, the Bolivia coup, all of these things he should obviously be impeached for. The Muslim ban, the kids in cages at the border, escalating the draconian deportation policy. The thing is, Democrats agree with him on all of these things. He will never be impeached for the war crimes he is responsible for, because they don't care. They align with him on 90% of all the terrible policies that he's participating in. The only reason that they cared about the Ukraine gate, allegedly, is because it was an affront to Biden. And you can't take out one of our own, right? That's how partisan this shit is.
And this is a good point, though. I mean, the Senate should remove Trump over this. I mean, of course, we can make the argument that he's done so many other things that he could be removed for, but this was a war crime. You can't just assassinate a leader of another country that puts us on the precipice of a major world war. The Senate should remove Trump for this, flat out. If it was a people's Senate, if most people are opposed to war, most people in this country think that this was a terrible action that Trump did, they should take him out now. I mean, they absolutely are within their legal parameters to be able to get Trump out of office based on this alone. And so it's not enough that like one or two members of the Senate would be willing to do that, but if a Senate that was worth a shit would use this immediately and say Trump and get Trump out of office over it, which I think is entirely possible.
Mike, you mentioned that 1 million Iraqis died. Sam Harris would actually say that was sectarian sectarianism that overtook the country and Sunnis and Shias killing each other. What is your response to that?
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, some
Not the
Iraqis
same
helped
as
the
that.
United States occupy the country, and some of them got killed by the Iraqis that were resisting the U.S. occupation. So, yeah, I mean, no, I mean, that's...
You mean we're not a benign empire and everything we do has good intentions, and so
Right.
it doesn't matter if 1 million people die because we had good intentions.
Centuries
we meant
old
well,
conflicts, yeah.
right? We meant well. So let's
So
talk
there were a
about
lot more super chats.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
But
Cool.
I couldn't read them all, and we appreciate everyone who's sending in donations to the super chat, which allow Empire Files to function. I was going to read questions from the super chat, but they were all just thank you messages, and so thank you very much
so
to everyone who dropped a thank you.
Yeah, if
and
you
threw
have
us
any
some bucks.
questions, please put out a super chat, and we would be happy to answer your questions.
We are going to try to take as many questions as possible after we get through this next little phase of going through kind of analyzing the presidential candidates. I did want to say another thing before we started, though, is that the whole, like, when we're talking about the, you know, everyone's surprised that Trump did this, and everyone's like, Bolton's really happy. It's like as if Bolton's somehow pulling the strings or whatever, right? This is just like a really unsophisticated analysis of what's going on. Like, Bolton isn't the only guy who wants war with Iran. Bolton is a functionary of a larger power structure that puts out, that like births out people like Bolton to go out and write the think pieces and do the interviews and do the advising, whatever. But he's like a product of a larger power structure within the U.S. ruling class that wants war with Iran. So it's not this idea that it's all embodied in Bolton and he's the guy who wants war with Iran, so he's somehow orchestrating things, or he's somehow like, yes, finally, or whatever. It's like, that's way too simplifying the problem. The ruling class of the United States, in particular, the oil moguls, the defense industry, the banks, all of these forces want Iran destroyed. And this isn't even so much, you know, like there's a lot of emphasis on, you know, regime change. Even Trump said, I'm not doing a regime change operation here. This isn't about regime change. That could be quite true. I mean, the U.S. doesn't always, all U.S. operations aren't always just meant to overthrow a government and put in a government that they like. A lot of times our goal is just to destroy the fucking country, right? Yeah. So like, to make it a crushed country so it can't stand up again. I mean, they're like in Vietnam, right? They're like, well, we lost Vietnam. We're not going to get a guy we like in there. Let's just destroy the whole country. And that way it'll be less of a threat to our interests around the world. The same thing with Iraq, the same thing with Syria. The goal is to make it a crushed country. If they get some kind of puppet that's friendly to the US afterwards, that's great. But honestly, the primary goal here, I don't even think is regime change with Iran. The primary goal is to destroy Iran.
So before we talk about, go ahead, were you going to talk more about that before we go to the Democrats and the...
No, I mean, we can't get into the Democrats. I guess I'll just preface it by saying that we want to go through what all the Democrats said because it's insightful into kind of what kind of president they would be. It says a lot about where they stand in kind of the larger political spectrum. But it's almost like, in a way, irrelevant at this point because if a war is starting, it's not going to matter who the next president is, right? This is now. It's urgent right now. I mean, to be honest, I mean, it feels like it felt when the Iraq war was starting in 2002, 2003. I mean, it's that same level of like danger. And so it's not going to, whatever's going to happen is going to happen before the election. So it's important to know what the candidate said in a kind of limited scope, but ultimately it's irrelevant. And I think that before we get into that, we'll plug it multiple times, but what's important right now is that you get active. We're going to be at a demonstration tomorrow. There's a national day of action all across the country to get into the streets to protest this possible war with Iran and protest what the U.S. has been doing and to call for U.S. troops to be removed. It's organized by the Answer Coalition, which is the organization that started days after the September 11th attacks and has been organizing the mass anti-war protests against Afghanistan and Iraq, Syria, etc. wars throughout the past, almost 20 years now. You can go to answercoalition.org to find a demonstration near you. It's happening in like 30 cities and towns all across the country. Here in Los Angeles, we'll be at Pershing Square at 1 p.m. We hope you join us there. But there's demonstrations everywhere. So go to answercoalition.org because, as I said, whatever the candidates are saying, that's great. But I think what's needed now is for the media to see people in the streets, for the Trump administration to see people in the streets, and for the Iranian and Iraqi people to see Americans in the streets opposing this. And so let's get into that.
We do need to put our bodies on the line. Mike and I want to talk about the efforts not only from Answer, but from Eyes Left. Your podcast with Spencer Rapone, Afghanistan war veteran, you have tools and resources, and you're giving advice for enlisted active duty soldiers and also people who are on standby that they could also be deployed if there is a war. Do you want to give a quick plug for that? And we could also do it at the end of this.
Yeah, so I will say this is really encouraging to me, but I've been on the phone today. Abby knows I've been on my phone nonstop because I've been talking to at least 20 active duty service members who some of whom most of whom I just contacted me today, never had any previous contact. Some of whom people that I was in the Army with and who have been in the Army for 17 years and are about to retire, and new people who have reached out who are all saying that I want to get the fuck out now. One of my friends who's been in for almost 20 years now, just coasting through his last year, he's like, I'm going to file for conscientious objector because I cannot be a part of this. I can't wear this uniform. But the fact that dozens of soldiers have reached out to us to say, what are my options? I'm not going to be a part of this, I think is incredibly encouraging. That's why it's important to have the biggest show of force possible tomorrow with these anti-war demonstrations, because we have to send a message to people in the military that you don't have to do this, you shouldn't do this, and there's a community of people who would support you in it. And so I just want to say that if anyone knows anyone in the military, if anyone's in the military, whether you're on the National Guard, on the reserves, on IRR, or whatever, that you should start exploring your options now, and it should be a wake-up call moment, right? This is where U.S. foreign policy is headed, regardless of whether or not we go to war with Iran now. It's easy to kind of think of these things in abstraction when we're at a low period and you're just like sitting around in the motor pool, like fixing a truck. But very quickly, things can change, and you want to be prepared to, you have to really ask yourself, are you on board with what's happening? Are you willing to kill or die for this absurd foreign policy that only serves the interests of the rich? And so if you go on Twitter @EyesLeftPod, our DMs are open. If you DM us and you need more information, I'll give you a signal number to text, which is encrypted, and then we can start talking that way. But if you're in the military, number one, if you're a part of any operations that have to do with this or mobilization, don't be a part of it. You will regret it for the rest of your life. And if you take a stand against it, it will encourage others to do the same. And we can build a resistance to what's happening from within the ranks of the military, which is very important. And if you're not in danger of going or being a part of any of it, this should be a wake-up call to what you really joined and were a part of. And if it's not today or in the next week that you're really having to do something that conflicts with your conscience, it's somewhere down the line. And so you should start prepping yourself now to combat it.
And you can file for conscientious objector status without going to prison. I mean,
yeah. All right. Conscientious objector status, it's a legal right for all service members. It's a relatively easy paperwork process. You just print out the application, you fill out the paperwork, you write a little essay about how you've changed your conscience about war. Definitely talk to me before you do it, because there's specific things that you have to hit. And then you just submit it. Your commander has no choice but to send it up to JAG. And if it meets all the requirements, you got an honorable discharge and you're out. And it's also a good way to get out of stuff quickly. Like if you're deploying in a week, if you put your packet in, they have to take you off deployment status while they're reviewing it. Mm-hmm. So it's not like, they can't deny it right away. It has to go through a weeks-long process. And so I've known people that were a week away from deployment, and it's like, I got my packet in, you can't deploy me. And then they're safe and they don't have to go on it.
Great.
But that's just one of many options. And so please reach out to me. My lines of communication are always open for service members who need help. And I wish I had those kinds of resources in March 2003 because I would have taken them.
Thank you, Mike. And also please subscribe to Empire Files. We're going to be doing regular live streams like this. And we haven't decided if we're going to make this private later for patrons or not, but we do survive solely on donations. Trump's sanctions on Venezuela actually shut down our ability to sell this show, The Empire Files, to Telesur, which is a Latin American conglomerate that was devastated by the sanctions. 40,000 Venezuelans have died since 2017 due to sanctions alone. So this is where we're left, is grassroots funding from people like you to sustain this show. And we are a unique show that looks at issues through the lens of U.S. empire, which is an issue that's largely omitted from all media, right? Largely. Of course, some alternative media covers this well, but yeah, I mean, most media completely omits the fact that the U.S. is the largest, most dominant empire that's ever existed. And it's impossible to look at any issue around the world without looking at it through that lens and understanding it through that lens. So
yeah, and if you haven't watched already, go to our playlist on the Empire Files YouTube and go to Trump Expanding the Empire. We have a couple documentaries that we've made, which is more if you haven't not familiar with our content, is more the style that we prefer and spend the most amount of time on, because it's a good like background to where we are today and what Trump's record has been, in particular in Iraq and Syria, leading up to this point.
Absolutely. So I mentioned the fact that Democrats have been complicit in this. Of course, we all know that Democrats are also a war party. They agree on 90% of all the terrible, disastrous policies from the Republican Party, right? So it's just kind of cosmetically disagreeing with some things. So the vast majority of Democrats in the House of Representatives, 188 of them just joined Republicans in voting to support that near $1 trillion defense budget. Now, what I didn't mention before is that the defense budget specifically had a provision that would have blocked Trump from waging a war with Iran. I think Tulsi, maybe Ro Khanna, and Bernie had something to do with, and maybe others, had something to do with putting this resolution in there. Of course, all of these people refused to basically demand that it maintain, Mike. They all just voted for the NDA after this provision was stripped. And so that's where we are today, with Trump just having complete dictatorial power, unilaterally taking measures that could potentially set us on the stage of World War III. So keep that in mind. As we're reading these quick statements, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. As Mike said, this is not really the focus here, is what the Democratic contenders are saying. We know that they're all jokes. And basically what I wanted to drive home here is how similar they all sound, Mike. Let's start with Elizabeth Warren and Julian Castro, who just dropped out, but I think it's important because he's considered this great progressive, even though he was in the tenure of the Obama administration doing bad things at HUD. But he had good rhetoric on immigration, I guess, so I guess he's a good progressive. But when it comes to waging a war with Iran, Mike, both of them literally are getting talking points from Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro and Liz Cheney, saying, if you want to just read it.
Oh, no, yeah, please read them. It's like identical statements.
I mean, Soleimani was a murderer.
This is Warren.
This is Warren, right? Soleimani was a murderer responsible for the deaths of thousands, including hundreds of Americans. Blah, 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 bullshit about strategically and how this is going to escalate the situation and how it's reckless. Moving on to Julian Castro. Soleimani was a murderer responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, including Americans. And then, again, reckless action puts us potentially in danger, strategic bumbling, blah, 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 blah. Literally indistinguishable from Liz Cheney, Ben Shapiro, Charlie Kirk. What does that tell you?
Like word for word.
Word for word. In fact, someone made a joke like, no, you stole my homework, like literally just copying my statement. Mike, let's talk about Joe Biden, who is perplexingly.
Can we talk about Warren's statement first?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, we mentioned it before, because Warren did something interesting, right? So Warren put out this initial statement, what we talked about earlier in this episode, right? Validating the rationale for war, that Soleimani was a terrorist, he murdered hundreds of Americans, thousands of other people. It's good that he's dead, but I disagree with how it was done. Completely not helpful. All that does is help the war effort. A terrible, terrible, very bad statement. So she comes out 24 hours later with a whole new statement, a whole new tweets about how we need to step back from the precipice of war with Iran. And it's like, oh, you think we forgot that you initially gave a really shit take that really just supported what the right wing and what the Trump administration is saying and acquiesced to their entire premise of this entire assassination? It was just funny that she got so much backlash from it, because it was she got trolled pretty hard. It was considered a very bad response. Her team doesn't seem like there's really progressives on it, so they're probably like, oh, dang, we did a bad anti-war tweet. We thought this was a good anti-war tweet. So much backlash that she just put out a whole new thing as if the other one didn't exist, which is really the kind of leadership we need right now, right? Putting out something that agrees with Trump and then realizing that you screwed up with the people whose votes you're trying to get. So you're like, actually, I want to say this instead. Yeah, just exposes her completely.
She's such a shill, backtracking on Medicare for all. Just the worst of the worst, right? Like the wine cave shit. It comes out that she had a wine cave fundraiser with Melissa Etheridge, charging $3,000 a photo. She is just such a joke. She's a pathological liar. She can't stop lying about her heritage, about her wealth, about her family. It's really sad. It's really sad. And it's actually good that she's dropping in the polls because we need her removed from the equation. I mean, she's really just a useful idiot at this point for people who are trying to make her a more palatable figure than someone like Bernie.
And she voted for 2 of Trump's war budgets.
Yeah, no,
and it
that's
gave him
amazing.
increases.
Yeah.
It's like at this point, everyone who voted for one of Trump's war budgets should be disqualified from the fucking race.
Disqualified.
It's like he's only able to do this. It's like they could have pushed back on his war powers. I mean, they could have been like, well, we're not going to give you the power to go to war and whatever. They gave him more money than he wanted. I mean, that's how he got the weapons to do this strike. And
yeah,
so
Space Force.
Yeah, anyone who's now pretending to be like, oh, no, bet you're doing a bad job with foreign policy, it's like, you have no right to say anything. You gave him all the money and gave him more money than he needed.
Yeah, and Elizabeth Warren has been horrible in every single foreign policy decision made, I think, since I've been aware of her. Venezuela, Bolivia, she didn't say anything. I mean, it's just absurd. She hasn't said anything about the military-industrial complex, anything about endless wars, anything about out-of-control military spending. In fact, Mike, she actually had the audacity, the shittiest take I think I've seen in a while from any politician, saying that we should green our military to combat climate change. Not mentioning the fact that the U.S. military is the greatest polluter and contributor of climate change in the world, but that we should just start greening our military. What, like giving them like recyclable materials to wear on clothing and like running hybrid tanks? Like, what are you talking about, Warren?
Well, I mean, it's not to get on a tangent about this, but it's funny. The reason the U.S. is the U.S. military is the biggest polluter in the world, bigger than like the next 10 countries and corporations and everything combined, is because the U.S. has so many bases around the world, and they're all just churning out toxic smoke and whatever, right? So instead of closing down those bases, the 1,000 or so military bases all around the world, she just wants to give them like solar panels or something like that. And so it just completely misses the point about why the US is the biggest polluter. It's because it's expanded all across the world and it's just sitting there shooting out toxic chemicals so they can like patrol like these random countries.
So let's move on to Joe Biden, who's perplexingly really high up in the polls. I cannot comprehend or conceive how he is possibly this popular. I don't understand this at all. My only hope is that the polls are only, just wrong. But we'll see soon, I guess, on that. Remember on the last debate when people were like, Joe Biden won this debate because he was alert for the first time. Joe Biden was alert for the first time. So let's just read the first two sentences from his statement. He says, no American will mourn Soleimani's passing. He deserved to be brought to justice for his crimes against American troops and thousands of innocents throughout the region. He supported terror and sowed chaos. And then he moves on to basically say exactly what you were elucidating, Mike, is that everyone kind of has this strategic analysis of how they would have done something better and they would have done it in a different way. But of course, you cannot say anything, Mike, without condemning how horrible and genocidal this guy was and how he's responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, including Americans.
Yeah, I do actually he had a follow-up tweet that was actually worse. Can you go to his Twitter?
I like how the reply guy Mike is replying to Joe Biden saying,
I was mad at
No, I know, I like it. I like that right under Joe Biden. I saw you being like, don't you have enough blood on your hands from Iraq? I mean, what a disgusting,
Biden,
reprehensible scumbag.
Yeah, Biden not only supported the Iraq war, he led the charge among Democrats to support the Iraq war. He was the one that went to every Democratic senator to rally them behind Bush to say, look, we got to do this. This is going to be great. Please get on board. So the reason the Democratic Party that they got the votes and all the support they needed to back Bush's war, Biden was the leader of that. And so for him today to be, and this is why his statement's so bad, because he knows his record. And so this new tweet that he just put out 3 hours ago saying the prospect of direct conflict with Iran is greater than ever. Does Donald Trump have a strategy for what comes next? And so it's not, oh shit, like we got to step back from a war with Iran. It's who's going to be the better commander in that war. Biden saying, I will be the better commander in fighting a war with Iran. Trump's a bad commander. He's going to do dumb things, but I'm ready for this war. I'll be the better war president. So it's just absolutely, exposes him as a really bad guy.
Yeah.
We absolutely, and like I said earlier, anyone who is a part of leading the charge to the Iraq war shouldn't be allowed to talk. And so Biden's one of those people.
Yeah, he needs to be, he's disqualified. He also just released a plan to fight anti-Semitism yesterday, right? This is his priority in January 2nd of the new year. And what does it say? It talks about how he needs to Trump's recent executive order that conflates like anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and essentially just makes Judaism under, or like, I don't even know what the hell it is. It basically just deems Judaism like a nationality and conflates all of these things together to prosecute BDS activism, right? We've already known that 27 states are doing this, and it's just a funny addition to Joe Biden's insanity that he actually releases the statement about BDS, right, and fighting anti-Semitism, and just makes it all about Israel. He's like, that's why I've been clear, the calls here to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel are wrong. He's like, the BDS movement signals out Israel in a way that's inconsistent with the treatment of other nations, veers into anti-Semitism, while letting Palestinians off the hook for their choices. What a bizarre ass thing to say, Biden. Letting Palestinians off the hook for their choices. Yeah, that's why BDS is wrong.
My plan to fight anti-Semitism is to stop pro-Palestine activism. That's great. That sounds like Trump.
Yeah, no,
that's literally Trump. Anyways, you're canceled, Biden. You've been canceled, but now you're fully canceled. This is like the big test. I mean, honestly, like the reason that we're going through these statements too is this is the biggest foreign policy moment in the past 15 years. I mean, since the invasion of Iraq, this is the most important moment, and where people show themselves now says a lot. So Julian Castro, you're canceled. You already canceled yourself, but you're canceled over your response. Warren, done. You're canceled. Your response was bad, and you voted for all of Trump's military budgets. Biden, of course you're canceled for the Iraq war. Now you're canceled again for giving this extremely bad, wanting to be the commander of the new war with Iran, but not condemning the war at all.
Right, and all these people just seem to be worried about strategy, the process, the timing. No one's questioning the underlying premise of the fact that the U.S. has no fucking right to be present in the Middle East, has no right to kill people anywhere in the world, has no right to do any of this. This imperial arrogance and bloodlust for war is atrocious, and it must be stopped. And that's why we're calling everyone to participate in this National Day of Action tomorrow in a city near you, or in your city, hopefully, that you can get out, put your bodies in the streets, show solidarity for the citizens and civilians of Iraq and Iran that need to see that we do not support what is going on with our criminal government.
Yeah, I just want to do one quick super chat question. Do you think Trump was fooled by the people who presented him this information to take action without fully understanding the ramifications? I think he just doesn't care. I mean, and the Pentagon, they know the ramifications, but they're not dealing with any of them. So why do they give a shit? I mean, Trump's probably like, well, like whatever happens, it's like I want to be a war president, and it'll be good for me in re-election and the impeachment and all this stuff. They just don't give a shit. They're rich people. They don't care about what happens to everyone else. That's like their whole deal. That's how they ended up in the positions that they're in today. Yeah, so I think he was aware of the ramifications, but just doesn't give a shit.
Yeah, just like in 2011 when he tweeted out, Obama's going to start a war with Iran to get reelected. Like he knows, I mean, he gets briefings on the sanctioned deaths caused by genocidal U.S. sanctions that are put on Latin American countries, on Iran, on Syria, on Libya, all of the things that he's drastically escalated since coming into office. He knows very well the human costs of these policies, so we should not let him off the hook. I mean, this is exactly the effect of what he's going for, and he's been, like Mike said, he was campaigning on a war with Iran this whole time. So we can't just put the blame on someone like Bolton, who's not even in the administration, or the generals. Simply, this is Trump being Trump. So let's talk about
who's canceled next. Who's next?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about Bernie, because Bernie, I was actually surprised it was much more than just a couple tweets, even though the tweets were relatively good. I was disappointed that he did not condemn unequivocally the killing of the commander. That should just be first and foremost. We need to condemn this extrajudicial assassination. This is a war crime, like Mike said. So aside from that obfuscation, he did much more than just a couple tweets. He actually did an entire 10-minute, at least, emergency press conference today that we watched, and I thought was really good comparatively. I mean, he addressed the war danger. He called it an assassination. He basically just repeats his warnings against the Iraq war. He says, again, war must be the last recourse in our international relations. We must do everything that we can to prevent this horrible suffering. He talks about the consequences of destabilization in the region, the countless lives lost, not only Americans and not only, of course, not only American soldiers, but he talks about the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, Iraqi civilians, which I thought was really important too. We must take into account the civilian loss of lives in these regions that were destabilizing and occupying and bombing. He talks about how he was I think the former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee or something like that when he was overseeing veterans issues. We've covered that before. He's been on the front lines talking about Gulf War syndrome and fighting for veterans benefits and healthcare that's adequate for veterans. And of course, he talked about the 30,000 homeless veterans in this country. And so it was interesting to see him tie that all together. And of course, he ends it kind of by saying something that I thought was really accurate and important, bringing it back to a class analysis, which you just said, Mike, which is rarely the children of the billionaires see the effect of these wars. It is people thrown in the meat grinder who are the working class, who are the poor, and they're the ones who are dealt with the brunt of the consequences and have to face the horrific reality of what these billionaires are doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this could be like a moment in the Democratic primary where Bernie flies ahead of all the rest, really drew a line. Nobody treated it with this urgency. No, every other candidate did like a tweet, 1 or 2 tweets. That's like whatever their take was. We're gonna get through all of them. Bernie's the only one that treated it like a national crisis. Like, this is an emergency. I need to devote all of my attention to this. I need to make a major speech. That was a major foreign policy speech. I mean, I encourage everyone to watch it. I wasn't expecting much. I was ready to be let down. But I would consider this speech he gave in response to Trump's assassination, and Bernie's the only one who's called it an assassination.
You sure?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I could be wrong, but as of this me checking up in this live stream, he was the only one who said it. The all-encompassing foreign policy speech, all U.S. troops out of the Middle East, acknowledging the horrible toll on the Iraqi people, the horrible death toll on the Iraqi people, and Iraqi sovereignty. You know, that the Iraqis want us to leave and we should leave. Which it's another thing we'll get to in a moment. I think that he outflanked every other candidate by making this a really major moment for him to say, this is how I'm going to lead, and what this is complete, and also talking about cooperating with Iran. I mean, the fact that he's the only one that said the solution to this needs to be us and Iran sitting down together and solving this peacefully, whatever happened peacefully. And so I think it was just far and away the strongest political statement. Number one, the strongest political statement in response to this. And number two, the only one that devoted the attention that it deserved, the urgency of it. I mean, it's urgent. I mean, it's of course the only thing we've been thinking about and talking about and reading about for the past 48 hours or so, because it's that serious. And to kind of see everyone just be like, oh, I did my tweet, I said my condemnation of it, and now I'm moving on to like whatever else. It's like no, it's like it deserves more. And I was, as a vet, what he said in that speech spoke to me. Of course, we've said this many times before. We are to the left of Sanders on foreign policy. He's done many things in the past we disagree with. He has many positions today we disagree with. But in terms of like this moment on the precipice of war, what you're telling to your supporters, what you're telling to your grassroots base, the orientation that Sanders gave and the condemnation that Sanders gave to his base and to the establishment was exactly what we needed right now. And I really do thank him for that.
Yeah, I just wanted to give one more critique of his speech. Other than condemning the assassination, he also said that Iran was a source of terrorism and that we should have used the diplomatic channels with the agreement to deal with that. So I think that again is falling prey to kind of providing cover for this Pentagon line that Iran is a source of terrorism. However, I completely agree with you. I thought the urgency and the level of seriousness that Bernie took it was, completely just outcast everyone else in the race. It just made him really stand above and show how important this issue was, Mike. And then he just continued to talk about it all day and talking about the need to cooperate, right? That he wanted to use the U.S. not as a source of perpetuating warfare around the world and death and destruction like we've so often seen, but also that the U.S. must use its power, wealth, and influence to actually cooperate and work with other countries to actually combat a real threat to humanity, which is climate change. So it's just amazing to hear someone speak with such clarity and urgency about an issue that I feel really dear to my heart. When in the past, really, even Bernie has kind of maybe issued just a couple tweets here and again when it was Bolivia. Of course, we know he was bad on Venezuela, but Bolivia, you know, we were excited that he said something good, but it's like now I think that he understands how devastating this escalation could be and how horrifically catastrophic escalating a war with Iran could be to so many people around the world. And so we're seeing him really shine at this moment.
Yeah, and even the thing he said about Iran being a sponsor of terrorism, I mean, he even said that within the context of, and Iran invited us to sit down at a table and talk about that issue. And the Trump administration refused to do that. And so, like, it was, I think, not the best thing to say, but it was also saying, if you think that this is a thing, we're not going to solve it by drone striking them. Like, there's ways that, you know, diplomacy can work and so forth. And so maybe the Iranian government will look at that speech and be like, maybe we should hold out until the election and maybe we can deal with someone different before we respond or something. But, you know, I agree with you that it was important to see, and he did the right thing and gave it the right amount of attention.
So let's move on to Tulsi. I don't want to spend too much time on her, but I think that it's important to first compliment her for taking another level of urgency. I don't think it was nearly the same level of urgency that Bernie took. She did issue some strong statements and also gave a small press conference where she said U.S. troops out of the Middle East. This is a very, very important...
Was that the town hall or was that a press conference?
I'm sorry, the town hall.
Yeah,
so
she was
doing a town hall live stream where she said troops out everywhere. That's something that we absolutely need as a bar, right? That we need to meet is U.S. troops out of Afghanistan and the war in Yemen, and of course U.S. troops out of Iraq and Syria. So I was happy to see that. Now, however, Mike, all of this was preempted by a statement that she made after the 25 Iraqis were killed by bombing before the commander was drone struck. So why don't you talk about that? Yeah,
so Tulsi had an initial statement after that those Iraqis were killed in that U.S. strike by Trump. And that was a pretty bad statement. Do you actually have the text of it?
I could find it.
Yeah, so it was bad for several reasons. And this is just prior to the assassination of this general. And so it shows why you shouldn't cave to Pentagon propaganda in moments like this, because very quickly it help lay the groundwork for what came next. Thank you, Abby, on the pee break. So she said, the problems created by Trump's impulsive, erratic military action and foreign policy are on display today. Trump's military strike against Iranian militia was impulsive, short-sighted, and lacked strategic purpose. Okay, so first of all, she said it was bad because it lacked strategic purpose. That's not why it was wrong. That's accepting that, it would have been good if it had a strategic purpose. Like, yes, this Iranian militia, she called it, which we'll get to in a second, they are our enemy, they should be attacked, but this way it lacks strategic purpose. So the entire framing of U.S. policy with a strategic purpose can be good, and that the criticism of this is that it didn't have an end goal or the mission wasn't clear. It's just falling into pro-military, pro-Pentagon rhetoric. But the important thing she said here is she said the strike against the Iranian militia. Now, this is even going further than what the Pentagon was saying and the corporate media was saying. They're saying Iranian-backed militia. It was Iraqis. It was an Iraqi militia. It was Iraqi people who had every right to be organized in the way that they were organized. Calling it an Iranian militia, not even Iranian-backed militia, was bizarre. I don't know why she did that. And it was wrong. And it helped kind of characterize these people as our adversary is in Iraq and it's creating destabilization and undermining our security in Iraq. And so it was this Iranian militia that we attacked. And so that was very bad. And then she went on to say that this is just the U.S. is doing this because it's being puppeted by Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda. Like, the U.S. isn't doing this because Al-Qaeda is puppeting them. That just doesn't make sense. It completely gets U.S. foreign policy wrong. This is tail wag the dog shit. Just because Saudi Arabia and the United States have congruent interests in the region does not mean that Saudi Arabia is dictating U.S. policy. I mean, Saudi Arabia is nothing compared to the United States. We're talking about the biggest military powerhouse the world has ever known. No one's telling the U.S. what to do. Not Israel, not Saudi Arabia. They are brought into the fold and under the wing and have a role in all of these operations. But it's U.S. imperialism. It's the U.S. ruling class whose interests are being served by this. Just because their interests are being met also doesn't mean shit. You know what I mean? So she gave this very bad statement, which was unfortunate. And then the assassination happens. And then there's a gap where we don't hear anything from her for a while until we get her most recent statement, which has some good things to say in it, but which also, of course,
the strategic purpose thing again.
Yeah, right. The whole lacking strategic purpose thing.
Or like, what is the end goal? What are we doing? That kind of thing. Where it kind of almost is rhetorically asking like, what's the purpose of this, and almost hinting to the fact that we could deal with this in a different way, which still I think is a wrong point to make.
Right. I mean, I full disclosure, like I've always been skeptical of Tulsi. I appreciate many of the things she said. I respect many people who are Tulsi supporters, but I've always kind of issued a warning. I've always said like, all this sounds great. A lot of the things she's saying is important. I'm glad she's saying them, but we don't fully know who she is. She hasn't been saying this stuff for long enough. And you never know how she's going to come down on certain key issues when there's important moments. And so I just always kind of urged some kind of skepticism with her while I appreciated certain roles that she was playing. This is from my own experience in the veterans anti-war movement. We had a lot of, in particular, military officers during the Iraq War who kind of had this patriotic anti-war framing where it was like the U.S. military is good, but this is a strategic mistake. And that was the thing that would always come up. The kind of internal debates in the veterans anti-war struggle throughout the Iraq War was the Iraq War was wrong because our mission wasn't clearly defined, or what was the strategic purpose and things like that. And that's the rhetoric Tulsi's used to describe the Iraq War and what she's using now. It's not about whether the mission was clearly defined. The issue is that it's a crime to bomb and invade another sovereign country and overthrow. That's the actual real issue. So it was unfortunate to hear those things. In her statement that she put out, I think today, like this afternoon or something, when she finally put out a statement about the assassination, do you have that? I mean, she did say some good things there.
I mean, again, she called for U.S. troops out everywhere, stop Trump's war
of Iraq and Syria.
She mentioned the fact that neocons are kind of happy at this and saying we need to stop Trump's war. So again, kind of bringing it back to the neocons, but also I appreciate her saying we need to stop Trump's war. I think that this is really an interesting point, this whole Tulsi Gabbard obsession that a lot of people have, because for the last 6 weeks, we've kind of been relentlessly trolled every time we talk about anything from Tulsi Gabbard supporters who don't understand that valid critiques of someone who is running for president, my friend. This is someone who is running for president. We should all be able to critique these people, including Bernie, which we just did on this live stream, from the left, right? They're never going to be pushed anywhere unless we push them from the left. So I think it's really odd to call valid critiques smears and say, how dare you smear the only anti-war candidate? We're not smearing her. We have valid questions, valid critiques, as we do everyone running for president. So I just want to get that out of the way. I know that the vast majority of Tulsi Gabbard supporters are really good people who are interested in fighting with us alongside, each other in the streets against the U.S. empire, and I really look forward to doing that with you. But we have to get out of this mindset because it's really divisive and destructive, and it just makes no sense.
Yeah, like we are anti-imperialists. That means something very specific. And none of the candidates are anti-imperialists in the way that we're anti-imperialists, which means that, and no one in government is. I mean, even the people who are the best on foreign policy aren't the best on foreign policy. And so a grassroots people who are anti-imperialists have to be part of a grassroots struggle that pressures politicians, that pressures those at the levers of power to come to the right positions. The only reason that Bernie and even Warren and Tulsi, for that matter too, are saying good things on foreign policy at times is because of grassroots pressure, because the work that we've all been able to do to raise these ideas and push them to the forefront. And so it's a product of those actions. And so we shouldn't stop because for any reason, to give someone a pass because of this or that strategy. And so I think we give everyone the same treatment there. We have to push all of them from the left. I think that her statement, calling it a targeted killing, that was important. She didn't call it an assassination, but none of the other candidates called it a targeted killing. She was the only one who did that. Calling for that the solution is troops out of the Middle East. That's very good. The kind of strategic purpose framing, again, it's almost like what Biden was saying in terms of what's the real strategy here and so forth. But we watched her town, I think the biggest thing is that this was her moment, right? I mean, Tulsi is running as the foreign policy candidate, the anti-war, anti-regime change Iraq veteran, right? That's like basically her entire branding for her campaign, right? Things that, it's not about Medicare for all, it's not about this, it's about we need a foreign policy commander who knows the cost of war and isn't making these decisions that serve Saudi Arabia and all this other stuff, right? That's it, right? That's her
the brand, right?
That's her whole brand. And now here we are in the biggest foreign policy moment since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, on the precipice of a major war. This should have been her moment to come out and make this like the center thing, to do at least what Bernie did, to have a major speech about it, to have a major press conference about it, to be putting out more videos than just one video that's 1 minute saying this is reckless and doesn't have a strategic purpose. Like the fact that it didn't become like the focal point of the campaign, I think she really missed the boat on it. I think this was an opportunity for her to do what Bernie did, was to say, this is a major foreign policy moment, and I'm going to show how I'm different than all the rest, and how we need to actually step back from the precipice, whatever. Like, it was almost like it was an afterthought. It was just like so small, the attention she gave to it, and the gravity of her statement was kind of so. It was almost like everything stuff that she says every day. It like wasn't very much different. Didn't seem that riled up about it. We even tuned in because we're like, maybe there's more than just, because I was watching her all day. Like, what else is she going to say? Like, what else? There has to be more because she has to like do more with this. This is like crazy that this is happening. And this is her whole deal. So we tuned into the live stream of her town hall in New Hampshire, right? Because she's like moved to New Hampshire to try to come out strong in the New Hampshire primary. And she did something that really disappointed me. Of course, she talked about how we need to get U.S. troops out of the Middle East and get troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan. That was very important. Very happy she was saying that. But she kept using this term nation building, that we got to stop nation building in these countries. Like that's a right-wing concept, that the U.S. occupation in Iraq and all this is nation building. We're wasting American blood and treasure to try to give a better life to these people around the world. Like nation building is a term that's only used by like right-wing like isolationists, and it's not something that we should be promoting. It's not what we're doing. We're not nation building anywhere. It's like a made up concept that in a way is like anti-interventionist, because like we shouldn't send people to help poor people abroad as if that's what we're doing, but it's disappointing. And so I was hoping to see her really come out stronger. This was her moment, and she missed it.
Yeah, I hope to see her come out stronger, now. I mean, hopefully people can be pushing her from the left and not giving her a pass on this and just saying, we need more, we expect more from you, you need to be a leader in this and be voicing concerns and really be out there completely outraged everywhere you go, because we are facing a really, really dangerous moment right now. Of course, I don't even know if Pete Buttigieg is worth talking about.
Sure.
He made such a horrible statement on the killing of Qasem Soleimani. He releases this absurd spook-ridden statement as the spook he is, saying the top priority of a commander-in-chief is to protect Americans' international security interests. There's no question that this general was a threat to that safety and security. How? How is he a threat to that safety and security? Again, just regurgitating Pentagon talking points without explaining, and that he masterminded threats and attacks on Americans and our allies, leading to hundreds of deaths. Again, how? How? So then he just talks about how, he's the right commander-in-chief because he knows the military, right? So this is, again, I know the military. I would have the correct military mindset. I would carry this out in the correct way. And he says, before engaging in military action that could destabilize an entire region, too late. You already fucking did that when you were in the Afghanistan war that you did not apologize for. And when Bernie at the last debate was like, that was wrong. He was like, that was not wrong. He was like, we should have gone into Afghanistan to get bin Laden. It's like, really, dude? And he's like, we must take a strategic, again, the word strategic, deliberate approach to that includes consultation with Congress, our allies, and stakeholders in the Middle East. What does that mean? So again, just
like literal like shareholders, not stakeholders.
Yeah. So it's just complete gibberish and just word salad that makes no sense. I just can't even imagine how horrible things would be if he became quote unquote commander-in-chief. He would be so trigger happy to do any of this shit, right? Because he's a military man and he knows how to wage a right war, a smart war, Mike.
Yeah, this is an example of, a lot of the times in American democracy is where the candidates in the primary, they're mainly not auditioning for the support of the American public, and the debates and their statements, they're auditioning for the support of the US ruling class to show that they can do the job as CEO of the American empire. And so this statement is almost like, you give this to an average person on the street, they're gonna be like, what the fuck is this? What is this? He was writing it for the sectors of the military establishment and the military industrial complex that don't really like Trump but are imperialist. This is saying to them, this is what I'm about, you like this, right? It's like, because there are factions within it. And so this was 100% just appealing for the support of a sector of the ruling class and the military elites. So you're canceled.
You're canceled, dude. You're totally fucking canceled. So let's wrap this up by just talking about a brief history of U.S. terrorism and warfare.
Was that all the candidates? Did Klobuchar say something?
I'm not even going to go there.
It was the same. It was the same as everyone else.
Can you imagine what Klobuchar said?
Yeah, she's the most right-wing of them all, I
She's
guess.
Horrible.
Shaky Klobuchar.
So yeah, right. Claimy Obachar. So let's talk about a brief history of U.S. terrorism and warfare waged in Iran, and then we can get back into what you can do, how you should be a part of this national action to stop this potential war. Zach Carter, our friend in Connecticut on Twitter, always love that guy. He always puts together good little listicles, breaking stuff down. That's what gave me the idea to do this really quick. I mean, really quickly, we all know about the CIA coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, a people's revolution that crushed them, of course, installed a brutal dictator until 1973, when that brutal dictator was overthrown, a U.S. puppet, the Shah. And ever since then, the U.S., has been just trying to destabilize and destroy the country even more. So supporting Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war, that's the notorious "we gave Saddam the means to make chemical weapons." That war resulted in hundreds of thousands of Iranian and Iraqi civilians dead. The shooting down of Iranian airliner Flight 655, killing hundreds of civilians. This was done on purpose. This was done to signal to the Iranian government that they needed to pull out and end the war. And of course, we haven't apologized for it to this day. Iran mourns it as a national tragedy every year. They have constantly asked for simply an apology for shooting down this airliner. Of course, we haven't heard the end of that Ukrainian airliner that was shot down that we almost went to war with Russia over by the so-called, Russian militias on the ground. But for some reason, the U.S. can shoot down civilian airliners willy-nilly, and it's just like breathing here. So that is horrific. A ton of children died on that plane. Of course, this is coupled with, ever since that moment, crippling sanctions that were devastating and exacerbated by the Trump administration. The overthrow of the nuclear deal, this comes with the, trying to destroy their nuclear energy program, the nuclear centrifuges with Stuxnet. So all of this kind of cyber warfare, cyber terrorism, employed on Iran, the double standard, the fact that Iran can't have nuclear weapons, but Israel, of course, can. Trump's ramped up these genocidal sanctions to levels unseen before. This is aside from the fact that the U.S. is surrounding Iran with dozens of military bases, hundreds of thousands of troops, and has enlisted in so many war games that have taunted Iran repeatedly, right? Including sending that drone in Iranian airspace. And of course, when Iran shoots down the drone, we somehow flipped that and somersaulted it as an act of war against us. Because how dare you shoot down weapons that we're sending into your airspace, and of course made up that whole false narrative that it was in international waters. It absolutely was not. But just, of course, you've seen that famous picture where, how did Iran, who's the real threat here? Iran has never waged war on its neighbors, of course, aside from, I guess, the Iran-Iraq war that was a defensive measure, and the dozens of military bases that are surrounding them. So again, who is the real aggressor here? There's dozens of U.S. military bases, war games, ships, troops surrounding them at all times. The war has already been waged on Iran, right? The war has already started. It started decades ago. It's never stopped. The sanctions are war. Sanctions are war. And, you know, these 3,000 troops to Iraq, this is on top of the 5,000 already there. And there's already 70,000 troops in this region, right? And not least 13,000 in neighboring Kuwait, which is the fourth largest military outpost next to Germany, Japan, and South Korea. So it just gives you a picture and some context of how Iran is surrounded and how it's been surrounded militarily by the ultimate aggressor, which is the US empire.
Yeah, well said. I think that in terms of next steps, what we're facing, as we said earlier, the most important thing now is to be in the streets tomorrow as a part of this National Day of Action, again, to show the Iranian and Iraqi people that we want peace with them, and to show this government, the media, all the people that are trying to spin, the politicians, everyone who's trying to spin this in another way, we need to show them that we're going to fight this war from happening. And, Abby and I, we came into political life through the invasion of Iraq. Like, if there's a moment for you to enter politics and become a political activist, I mean, ever since the Iraq War started, we've been political activists ever since, because it was in that mass movement of millions of people all around the world and in the United States coming together to fight it that led us to where we are today. And this should be that moment for you too, if you're not already politically involved. Go to answercoalition.org, find the demonstration near you, reach out to the organization. If there's not a demonstration near you, plan one, they'll put it on the website, reach out to the organizers, because it's so important for us to do this tomorrow and to form these networks now, because there's might be much more to do in the days ahead. I do want to say that if Iran does respond militarily, I mean, everyone's talking about what Trump did is terrible. All of the people like Warren and all these people that are saying what Trump did was bad, it's going to put us on the precipice to war. If, say, Iran does respond, which is possible, and, logically, it's like, how can they accept something? Because say they kill some American soldiers in Iraq. Say they launch an attack on an American base in Iraq as retribution, like kill an American general. All the people that are like the weak criticisms of Trump, the Julian Castros and the Bidens and the Warrens of the world, their tune is going to change. And they're going to start saying, well, we've been attacked, and so we do need to do something. We can't allow Americans to be killed. Right now, when it's just the US killing Iraqis and Iranians, it's easy to oppose it. But it's going to get harder if Americans start dying as a result of this. This is what led to the fucking meat grinder of the Iraq War. The US went illegally, invaded, and started killing people and overthrowing their government. Then some Americans started getting killed. They said, oh my God, some Americans are killed. We got to send more soldiers because you can't kill Americans. So more soldiers went in, more soldiers got killed. They said, oh, well, we can't allow that. We got to send more soldiers. And before you know it, it was the worst phase of the Iraq War, where like 100 US soldiers a week were dying and thousands of Iraqis per week were dying. So if anyone tries to convince you that if Iran responds, or if this Iraqi militia responds, or the Mahdi army responds, that is not their fault. That is Trump's fault. That is the Pentagon's fault. If any Americans die now, it is on the fault of the US government, not anyone who's in their own country who is defending themselves or retaliating against this blatant provocation by the United States. And everyone has to be ready to stand strong in the face of that, because that should not deter our anti-war activism in any way. And we're going to see a lot of politicians fold if that happens. I do want to say that...
Yeah, they're already folding with just the made-up rhetoric about how this guy killed...
He was going to attack us.
He was going to attack us,
if
right?
they actually attack us, right.
Just like Saddam, he had WMDs, right? He was going to pose a threat in the future.
And this was important during the Iraq War. It was, yes, it was for soldiers and people that I knew that were, coming home in pieces and all this stuff. It was the most important thing to say to them is this is not the Iraqi people's fault. This was George Bush's fault. This was Dick Cheney's fault. These are the people that did this to you. And if you want to be mad at someone, be mad at your government. So if anything happens, we need to point the finger at who is to blame, and not the people that have the actual right to fight back. The last thing I do want to say about this is the whole premise of the invasion of Iraq. This is another major development that happened. The entire premise of invading Iraq, of course, beyond the WMDs, was that Iraq needs a democracy, and it's going to be a better place. They need to have a democracy. That was like the main thing that was drilled into our heads. Even that WMDs thing was like a joke. It was like, yeah, WMDs, but we're going to do a great thing and bring them a democracy. So we overthrew the Iraqi government. We imposed this parliamentary system. We imposed this whole new structure on the country, this Iraqi parliament, which we picked who's going to be in it, how many seats get to be Shia. So we orchestrated this whole fucking thing, this whole democracy that we killed 1 million people and 5,000 soldiers to get. This Iraqi parliament just voted today that all U.S. forces have to leave, okay? So if you want to respect the lives of the 5,000 Americans who died and the 1,000 Iraqis who died to bring 1 million Iraqis who died to bring democracy to that country. Well, that democracy just democratically decided that the U.S. has to get out. And if the U.S. says, no, we're going to stay, and that there's a war that starts because the U.S. refuses to leave, it just is completely backwards. Well, that's the whole fucking reason why we were there. Now we're saying we have to stay because Iraqi democracy is wrong and can't make its own decisions. And so that's another main thing we have to point out. Iraq voted for us to get out. The U.S. needs to get out, unequivocally. All U.S. troops, all air power, all drones flying over it, done. Got to get out. Dismantle the bases. And if we don't do that, things are bound to escalate, if not now, at another point in the future. And we have to listen to what the Iraqi people want. The Iraqi people want us out. They've been telling us they want us out for the past 15 years by shooting at us and also by demonstrating against us. And it needs to happen. And we all need to play a role in forcing the U.S. to meet the demands of the Iraqi people who deserve to be heard.
So please get out in the streets tomorrow at the National Day of Action. Go to answercoalition.org. Subscribe to Empire Files on YouTube. Empire Files, you can check out our catalog of work on the empirefiles.tv. If you like this t-shirt that I'm wearing, we sell things on our Shopify. Do you know our little Shopify store?
Empirefiles.store.
Empirefiles.store. Check it out. We have a bunch of cool t-shirts there. We're trying to raise money to continue our investigative programming to shed a light on all of these things, debunk the Trump narrative that he's an anti-interventionist, really show what's happening quote unquote strategically on the ground that is expanding and exacerbating U.S. militarism and empire in every region of the world. We have exposés coming out about Afghanistan, about U.S. militarism in Africa. That's coming out in the next couple weeks. Please stay tuned for that. And please participate in the National Day of Action and also all the recurring actions that are sure to happen to keep the momentum, keep the pressure on our elected leaders, because this is the only way change ever happens. There is no savior 2020. It doesn't matter who wins the presidency. All that matters is the resistance that we mobilize in the streets, the momentum that we build in solidarity with our brothers and sisters living under the boot of empire in the Middle East, in Latin America, all other oppressed nations. Please join us. Get offline, get in the streets. It's time. The time is now. Mike is organizing active duty soldiers, people on reserve that are potentially going to be called for whatever escalation comes. Please contact Eyes Left Pod on Twitter. The DMs are open. He is coordinating with soldiers right now to talk about how you can file conscientious objector status. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you liked this live stream. Please subscribe to our channel and support us on our Patreon, patreon.com, Empire Files, so we can keep these things going as much as we can. We really appreciate your support. We appreciate all you tuning in. We appreciate people giving the gravity of this situation that we know it deserves. So keep the pressure on, guys. Y'all rock, and we'll see you in the streets tomorrow.
Thanks, y'all.